My name is Ronan O'Gallagher. I'm one of the founders of Thriftify, which is the online charity shop. We're kind of like Depop, but for charity shops. And we are pretty big in Ireland. We launched in Britain about 9 months ago, and we're growing here quite quickly. But I'm delighted to be joined by 3 amazing panellists who I'll introduce shortly. But firstly, just a thank you to all the team at Sustainable Fashion Week for inviting us along, and you're all very welcome to this panel on Planet. It's just a very small subject. It's just the entire life cycle of the entire fashion industry, so I'm sure we'll get through it all and cover everything in an hour. No, we won't. But we'll definitely touch on some really good subjects, and we have an amazing group of panellists here who I'm going to introduce. So next to me I have Sophie Robinson. Sophie is the Business Development Manager on the Fashion and Textiles team at the Soil Association. And her desire to understand and improve supply chains stems from a practical upbringing spent crafting and sewing with her seamstress mother. The rise of fast fashion led her to consider the health and systemic impacts of the textiles industry, and prompted a transition from her systems role within the organic food sector. And she hopes at the slower pace of the past 2 years will transition into more thoughtful buying practices with sustainability, circularity and thriftiness now becoming a real consideration for the British public. So welcome, Sophie. Next to Sophie, we have Belle Jacobs. Sorry, no, I'm wrong. Did you just change seats quickly now? We have Emma. Emma's the founder of Southwest England Fibre Shed, Bristol Textile Quarter, and co-founder of Bristol Cloth. She's an academic background in political and economic anthropology, Indigenous rights, natural resource development, and conflict. Her work over the last 15 years has been at both grassroots and global policy levels. Happiest with feet on the ground and working in the community, the combined environmental, social, and political motivations of the Fibre Shed movement marry her intellectual interests with a lifelong passion for textiles, clothing, and artisan products. And she lives on a 12-acre small holding with her husband and daughter, and keeps belted Galloway cattle and golden Guernsey goats. It sounds really dreamy. I wish we were all there now. And lastly, Belle Jacobs is a freelance writer, speaker, and activist, and was the style editor for Metro between 1999 and 2013. Today she focuses particularly on animal rights, the climate emergency, and the toxic fashion system. She runs 2 websites, bellejacobs.com and How Now magazine, both focusing on positive initiatives changing fashion and the wider issues around sustainability. And she is a coordinator of Extinction Rebellion's Fashion Action, the group behind kind of groundbreaking campaigns really, including Boycott Fashion and Cancel Fashion Week, which I absolutely loved. A new fashion project, Act Now, aims to speed up change in the industry in line with the collective emergency we now face. So aren't they all amazing? Yeah. Great, so I just want to give each of you an opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about the work that you're doing. And I'm going to start with Emma, who also has a couple of slides as well that she's going to take us through.
Good morning. So I founded Southwest England Fibre Shed in 2015, having come back to England after nearly 5 years living overseas in South America. And I found this word and thought, this is kind of what I've been trying to do. This is a word that makes sense. And it's a word coined by a woman called Rebecca Burgess from 2011. And essentially a fibre shed is, the idea is that within a fibre shed you can find all the natural resources, the knowledge, the expertise that you need to be able to create clothing in a very specific area. So it's a geographic region, but it's also now a global movement. There are, I think, over 60 affiliates across the world. I was the first one to affiliate in the southwest of England, but we've now got 8 across the UK. And we all spend time building communities to connect fibre farmers with dye growers, with processors of fibres, with brands, with designers, to create communities who are working to create systems for textile and clothing production within a regional area. So all of us, we go about our work in very different ways. There is no blueprint for how a fibre shed manifests and how we run one, but all of us are working very much to this model, which is the soil-to-soil model for fibre and textile production. Essentially, it's saying if we grow the fibres that we need to make our clothes, be they plant fibres or animal fibres, process them in just, equitable systems that provide livelihoods for people in the bioregional community, then we're ultimately creating garments that are 100% natural, and at the end of their life cycle you can literally put them on the compost heap and they can nourish the next cycle of life. And that's working entirely within nature's own systems. It's not requiring anything fancy, high-tech, energy-intensive, chemical-intensive. It's actually very simple. This is a bioregioning project, and probably a term that we will hear more and more, in that it's in a given geographical area, which invites us to think about that place not only in terms of the local ecosystem, but also in terms of the communities involved. This is a quote that came from the Bioregional Learning Centre, which is a fantastic resource that we have in the southwest in Devon. And these are kind of regions, kind of units of scale that humans have inhabited for hundreds of years. It's nothing new. It makes sense because it's a manageable space. So I guess this is the kind of the main impact environmental issue that Fibershed is working to address. And I just like everyone to think about this question for a moment. Do you know which carbon pool provides your clothing? Do you know, without looking at the labels on your clothes right now, what everything's made from? Is it natural? Has it been grown? Has it been produced on a farm? Is it something that you could feel happy putting back in your garden at the end of its life cycle? Or is it extracted from the lithosphere, a non-renewable resource that has been somehow manufactured into a synthetic fibre, fabric derived from fossil fuels, which ultimately, at the end of its life cycle, will remain where it lands for a very long time, far beyond our own lifetimes, and clog up landfill. So just like that, that's kind of the question that we ask of everybody. Do you know where that comes from? Do you know what your clothes are made from? These are the bigger issues in more detail. The fossil fibres, if you're wearing synthetic fibres, you're not in the minority. It's kind of 3/4 of the clothing now that the world producing is derived from fossil fibres. We are producing and consuming way beyond our social and geographic bounds. That is, in the UK, we still import most of our fibres. The climate crisis, so we could be producing fibres within a very healthy, organic, regenerative system, which I know Sophie would have spoken to earlier today, or we can be using things from the lithosphere and fossil fuels, using practices which release carbon into the atmosphere rather than sequester. And then the final thing is waste. We all know probably that there's far too much consumption going on. Fashion's too fast. And the average item of clothing is worn so few times before it goes to landfill. Whereas the Fibershed system would say, well, actually, yes, it's going to take a long time to produce one item of clothing, and it's not going to be cheap. But at the end of its life cycle, when we finally stop using it, which hopefully will be after years and years rather than a week, it's only going to return back to Earth. So the waste in itself is not a damaging thing. And I just want to leave you with this quote by Rebecca, who founded the Fibershed movement. And this is really what connects fashion back to farming for Fibershed. The two were always connected and have become radically disconnected in the last 100 years with the introduction of synthetic fibres. And we have a choice. You know, we can use clothes that are produced within systems that feed and nourish the planet, or we can wear clothes that are doing the opposite, are extracting resources that we can't use again and ultimately leaving a residue of plastic everywhere. So that's the kind of the Fibershed system in a nutshell.
Amazing. Thank you very much. I think that's a really good overview. And in terms of like scalability and the volume of clothing that's required to clothe people, not the volume of clothing that people are currently consuming, where's the Fibershed at globally in terms of like how much is being made? Is it possible to make everything this way?
So this is a question that we get asked a lot, unsurprisingly. A bioregional system is not making to scale. It's a very community-rooted system, much in the same way that an organic food system is, or an organic food box. It's not going to be the answer to our current system of high street fashion that produces to the volumes it currently does, and nor would we ever want to try and replicate a production system that produces to that quantity. when it comes to creating clothing at a viable, affordable price, there's a lot of work we have to do in shifting consumer expectations around how much they should be able to pay, encouraging consumers to understand the true costs of a garment, that someone somewhere is paying the cost of that incredibly cheap high street item if you're not. And it's about asking the people who can afford to, and the brands that can afford to think about sourcing things in a way that's more responsible, because there are plenty of people out there who have the power to put their money where their mouth is and think about how they're buying, how they're sourcing fabrics in a much more responsible way. And even if some of the brands can shift, then we've got a hope of pushing things in the right direction.
Okay. And Sophie, on your perspective, maybe a little bit of an introduction to your work in the Soil Association, and for people who don't know, tell us a bit about the Soil Association, but also picking up on that point around the production and manufacturing of garments and like the impact it's having on soil and how it's all tied in.
Yeah, so the Soil Association was originally a group of farmers who founded essentially a charity in 1947 because they were concerned about the way that food production was changing. After the Second World War, it started to have far more chemical inputs as a result of munitions factories, and being able to use those fossil fuel-derived nitrogens for something else. And then this sort of progressed throughout the rest of the last century as we sort of saw communism come to the fore. The agricultural treadmill was used as a way to show that we were able to provide for all of the people within our countries. So the Soil Association, founded way before that, has been campaigning for better agricultural practices, primarily with regards to food production. And from there they actually created a certification body because they believe that, well, you need to be able to measure whether something is sort of truly organic. And in sectors like food, there is a lot of legal legislation around it that is perhaps lacking in sectors such as beauty or textiles, which are the ones that I work in. So therefore, from my perspective, I think that what we're doing is very important, because you can say this garment is made from organic cotton, and you can say that even if it has 1% organic cotton in it, that would be absolutely fine to say. Whereas if you are actually producing something to a certification standard such as GOTS or OCS, which are two of the standards that we certified to when we were actually a founding member of GOTS when it was initially created, you're giving people a minimum level that they have to get to. So in order to call something organic in GOTS, you must have at least 70% organic fibres within that makeup. So that's broadly what we do. And as far as impacts, I think even if we're looking first at the very beginning with how we're agriculturally growing something, as I said before, people often don't realise that fertilisers are actually very often made from fossil fuels. So you have an enormous fossil fuel input simply into growing something before you even move on to your tractors or what have you that you're actually harvesting with. And with that, of course, comes runoff. So chemical runoff into waterways, which can then impact biodiversity, both on land, but also in our waterways and in the ocean. And actually, when you're farming organically, research has shown that the soil can actually take twice the amount of water of a conventional soil, which provides some protection from drought and also from flooding, because it is more readily able to absorb water. And it can actually sequester twice the amount of carbon. So you're actually beginning to bring some of that carbon that is getting released into the atmosphere all the time back into the soil and keeping that soil healthy, but also helping with the various greenhouse gas emissions. I think very often people don't realise that agriculture is a massive contributor to greenhouse gases. About 18.3% of greenhouse gases from the UK are from agriculture. And I think also when we get into fashion, fashion is the third highest producer of greenhouse gases, coming only after packaging and construction. So I think you really need to be... There are so many horrible things that are happening with just inputs that you don't realise the outputs they produce. So for us, I think actually having a standard and something to work towards that's clear and demonstrable can be very helpful in creating a solution.
And in terms of where we're at today, so we know that probably most of the stuff we're wearing is made from polyester or synthetic cotton, which is oil. What's happening with organic cottons and organic materials and the certification? Are we making good progress? Are we making more clothing from better materials, or what's happening?
Well, it's an interesting one. So cotton is the one that's most commonly spoken about because it is the fibre that we use most often when talking about organic. And there is a massive demand because everybody has realised that actually if you can make something out of organic cotton, it's got a good premium on it. Now currently only less than 1% of cotton that's produced worldwide is actually to a certifiable organic standard. So it shows you what a valuable commodity that can be, and perhaps why people might be tempted to use a tiny percentage so they can say that it's made with organic cotton. I think organic is a tricky one because it can be very hard to scale, as we were saying before, but actually I think more generally changing the way that we farm to be more regenerative and taking into account actually what we're putting in and therefore what we're getting out is really important if we're going to move forwards and create a less damaging system.
And I'll come to you on kind of the consumption side of things and the problems, I guess, with the fashion industry. As we know, you're involved in Extinction Rebellion and other activist groups as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about just your work and perhaps what motivated you to get into the kind of work that you're doing, which I think will open some eyes maybe in terms of the problems we face?
Yeah, so actually my CV that you gave, it's changed. I think the main thing that I would say is I spent 12 to 13 years as a fashion editor, so I was deeply immersed within the fashion world, really loving the fashion world, really loving the glamour of it, and getting to interview amazing people like Khloe Kardashian and Kate Moss, and just really sort of, and I was spending a lot of money on clothing. It was Rana Plaza that made me come out of that system and really opened my eyes. I was tentatively aware that something was wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it until over 1,100 women lost their lives in the collapse of a garment factory in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And I think that was a wake-up call for a lot of us, a lot of my colleagues, a lot of my peers. Now, a lot of my peers slipped back into the system and got overwhelmed again by the glamour of fashion, but it really raised too many questions in me for me to step back, so I left my job. And I remember a lot of people going, "You just left the best job in the world, why?" And the reason was because I started to understand that the fashion industry is one of the most polluting and damaging industries on the planet. And since then, I've done a lot of different things to try and address this. So I joined Extinction Rebellion, the fashion team. We held a funeral march in front of the British Fashion Council during London Fashion Week to try and raise some of these issues. And I've also moved more deeply into climate activism, climate justice activism, and now into animal rights activism. They're all interconnected, they're all interrelated. One of the things I find hardest, though, is that I've now done a lot of panels when I'm faced with good people like you seeking to change things, and knowing that actually in the sort of 6-7 years since I've been talking about these things have just got worse. We were talking earlier on, actually, consumption of clothing is going up, use of fossil fuels is going up, consumption of meat and dairy products is going up. All of these are related to industries that are incredibly bad for the planet, incredibly bad for our culture and our belief in ourselves as conscious people, as good people. So I now have set up, I've shut down one website, How Now Magazine, I've set up a website called The Empathy Project, trying to reframe how people see animals in this world. It's much more vital than we realise. I want to reframe veganism as a political stance. It's been happening already. I just want to do it from a particular perspective. I talk about alternative fashion systems that rely heavily not on alternative fibres, though these are really important, but on ideas of degrowth. Now, degrowth is a kind of word that gets a lot of people who really rely on the current economy jumping around and very nervous. But actually, degrowth, I think, is the only way forward. The moment when I realised this is when I looked at a really, really complex biodiversity plan by, I think it was Kering, one of the big luxury producers of fashion. And I realised that every effort, every expert they brought on board, all the millions of dollars they were churning into this was completely being wiped out by their production levels. So essentially, when you have a biodiversity plan, but you're still continuing to produce billions of pieces of clothing a year, you're greenwashing. And actually, you could do more good just going, we're not going to produce as many clothes. So degrowth is a fundamental for me, veganism is a fundamental for me, decolonisation is another fundamental for me. We have to return power and rights back to ordinary people on the other side of the world who are currently facing the most devastating impacts of anthropogenic, human-induced climate change. We've all seen what this summer has brought. Like I said to my friends up here, I am the person often in the room going, we really have to move now. This summer, 40 degrees temperature is going to become a norm for our children. We are looking at extended periods of drought for our children in this country. And that's bad for us, but can you imagine what it means for people in Africa? So as I say to people, if you think elephants are going to survive beyond the end of the century, you need to look again at what's happening out there. So one of the things that we discussed, one of the things I work on a lot now, is culture change. How do we get people to wake up to this without freaking them out so much that they're, motionless? We have to realise that that is an ongoing project. But if you don't see the truth, you won't act. You won't act appropriately. So that's where I am right now in the work that I do.
Amazing. Give us the name of the website again.
Oh, it's the Empathy Project. It's information, but yeah, I've got big hopes. But I also run a climate centre in North London as well. So.
Okay. The Empathy Project. Thanks for that. And what are some of the examples you've seen of positive work and mobilising people? What are some of the examples that have happened that you've seen, I suppose, more recently?
I still think Extinction Rebellion is probably the best and last hope. Now, I know that not everyone agrees with their methods, and certainly with things like Just Stop Oil and Insulate Britain, we've had a lot of controversy. I'm not part of those movements. I haven't been arrested, and I don't put myself up for arrest. But I believe that Extinction Rebellion is a mindset in which you kind of go, I know how bad things are, and I need to act. And once you do, it becomes a lot easier to kind of go, I need to do that, but I need to stop doing that, and I need to do that, and I need to stop doing that.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. One of the other things I just wanted to touch on as well was the key levers. And I think sometimes we miss the point when we talk about people need to change their behaviours, whereas actually we're up against some quite powerful lobbies in the industry. So maybe I might just ask yourself, what are kind of the key levers, and who actually is responsible? Who should we be targeting systemic change at?
Well, I think very often people do like to blame the consumer. However, I do think that you need to understand how we are being marketed to create this. So I found a statistic that in 2019, The Guardian found that a third of young women would consider an item of clothing to be old when they've worn it once or twice. Now, this has to be something external that's suggesting that to them. And if you look at shows like Love Island, who ends up with partnerships with fast fashion, and they are constantly wearing a new item, we are very clearly being marketed that in order to be attractive and in order to be hip, you need to always be seen in a different thing. So I think that definitely what we are exposed to in terms of marketing, even very insidiously through the television shows that we watch, I think that's a really key thing to be aware of.
Surely Kourtney Kardashian is the new sustainability ambassador for Boo. Surely that's the...
This got me. So I saw this. I came down from Edinburgh to London at the beginning of last week, and all over the tube it says, "Boo-hoo, Kourtney Kardashian, new sustainability ambassador." And I thought, what does she know about sustainability? So I looked into it. But basically, what it is, they've got a line that they're doing with her of 47 items, which will 41 of them contain some recycled fabric in them. One of those items is as low as 0.5%, which I think at that point is not really worth doing. But you've got 47 items there that they're making this big thing about, that's being shown all over the underground, on television, wherever. But actually this year they're going to produce 40,000 different products that you could buy. So that's such a tiny, tiny little percentage, and yet we're being told, oh, look, they're doing such a good thing.
Maybe Emma, in terms of your work and communicating the benefits of genuinely sustainable fabrics, how are you doing that, and are there lessons that we can learn to bring people on that educational journey, maybe away from being sold by the big shiny marketing spend that we see on the tube for Kourtney Kardashian and Boohoo? Whereas, how do we bring people on that educational journey, I guess, is what I'm asking, and convince them that actually the kind of stuff that Fibershed is doing is much more the answer?
Really good question. So, I mean, I've already said that Fibersheds across the country, across the world, go about their work in different ways. But in the Southwest, one of the things that we have done is some storytelling and awareness raising. So we produced a short film last year that was premiered at London Fashion Week called Fibershed Reconnecting Farming and Fashion. It's also on YouTube. And that was really just trying to seize that idea in the fashion industry and ask people to ask themselves, why aren't we advocating and using the natural fibres that we have a wealth of already in this country? Why do we export 90% of our wool and then import kind of wool synthetic mixes from China? So that's one thing that we do, and we kind of develop relationships within the fashion industry, more so in the Southeast England Fibershed actually, that has that proximity to London. We invite designers and students onto farms to have that tangible, like, direct relationship with natural fibres and with the people who are growing them. And that's actually going to be a big focus for the next year or two. We're developing a toolkit right now, both for farming and fashion sectors, to be able to get to grips with the resources that are out there and to facilitate conversations between themselves with a language that they can both understand, because these two sectors have become so disconnected they barely know how to talk to each other anymore, to be able to collaborate. So yeah, the next few years is really about bringing people together, ideally on a farm or in a studio where they can start to understand a little bit about each other's lives and find ways of working together.
Bringing people on a kind of an educational journey.
Yeah.
Amazing, yeah. And Belle, similar kind of question of, is it about bringing as many people as we can on an educational journey, or is it about just getting serious about targeting and shutting down major fast fashion organisations and targeting them directly with as many people as we can round up? Or how do we strike that balance?
Okay, so in order to achieve the change, we need to see all parties need to be involved. A lot of people have said consumer action isn't going to work by itself. I tend to agree. But I also think that consumer action, our action as individuals, is important, not only because it allows us to live in alignment with our values. I speak particularly as someone who is vegan. You know, I couldn't eat meat now because of what I know about animal agriculture. Horrendous suffering. So I live in alignment with my values. The other great thing about consumer action is it allows you to model ways of being that we need to see into the future. So you're almost preempting what we need to all be doing. At the same time, we cannot lose the political element to our work. So it's not enough to go, well, I bought a pair of organic cotton jeans, job done. We now have to agitate for change. So you communicate with the brands, you join up with communities to petition government, you talk to, everything that you can do, you have to do. The thing that isn't targeted is being spoken about a bit more as my former industry, or my current industry, I don't know, media. One of the absolute fundamental starting points of the degrowth principle, as enunciated by one of its leading speakers, Jason Hickel, you cannot get to degrowth without ending advertising. Advertising is responsible for painting a picture of the world that is not what is happening right now. Okay? And we know, we talked about this before, if you look at things, the greenwashing is incredible. There was that statistic that Shell spends more on advertising its renewable energy than it does on its renewable energy. Okay, so I think the corporates know that with media advertising, they have an incredible weapon to control the narrative. So we have to actually call that out as well. And I find it, I don't know about you guys, but I find it really difficult to open a fashion magazine now, because I just see a whole load of hogwash. And we don't need any more clothes. It doesn't matter that this person is a celebrity because they've been on Love Island. None of this is about what's happening out there to ordinary people in the global south and increasingly in the global north. We've just had floods in Italy that killed 12 people. Does anyone know about that? I only found out about it. It was on social media. The media is not reflecting what is going on. Do not listen to the media. Look for other sources of information. One of the sources that I follow on Twitter is I follow about 5 or 6 key climate scientists. And from them what you get is climate breakdown in real time. Because these are the guys going, this glacier's just fallen. These people have just died in Kenya. And so that's where you start to get, oh my God, this is really, really serious. That's what's going on. On a more positive note, one of the aspects of the activism that we do is visioning, because the alternatives to the world that we currently live in are better. It is better not to be over-consuming. It is better to be living with respect to other beings on this planet. It is better to understand the suffering and trying to address it. It is better. So there's a lot of visioning work going on amongst activist circles now, so that we don't just freak people out, we freak people out and then we go, here's the alternative. And then hopefully they will move towards that.
Yeah, and I think it is amazing to have clear examples like the fibre shed of what the alternative can be. One of the other questions I have is just, maybe for the other two panelists as well, is there other educational journeys that you both have gone on that maybe freaked you out or scared you that have changed your personal behaviour? And maybe I'll give an example first because it's a strange question. But I think one of the things that has changed my behaviour is awareness of microfibre pollution. And if you don't know, at the moment you're consuming about 4 grams of plastic a week, mainly through the water that you're drinking. So that's about a credit card a week. So imagine 52 credit cards stacked up. You're eating those every year. And this is a new phenomenon. And scientists aren't really able to tell us what the impact of that is going to be. They reckon it's going to have major impacts on fertility, cancer, and loads of other reasons. There's no research behind it. And one of the things that has changed my behaviours is I have a filter on my water now. I've invested in £70 a year for a really good filter on my water. So that's an example, I think, of learning something and saying, oh, that is actually serious. And water and microfibers is something I get really involved in a campaign on and trying to educate as many people as I can on. So are there other examples like that that might be beneficial for the audience or for other people? Because I do think there's something really powerful about bringing people on that educational journey. I'm just interested in what other stuff like that don't I know or should I be aware of?
I mean, I think for me, I have never been a big fast fashion buyer, but you know, if I wanted to get rid of something, I would very often use deposit systems where you could go and give a bag of clothes somewhere and they'll give you a £5 voucher and you're like, great, so actually this is going to be recycled. Textiles Exchange recently did a study which found that 52% of the initiatives they surveyed actually had no idea where their recycled fabric went afterwards. And what we actually see is that it ends up in other countries, just as we do with everything. We export our fashion waste. You end up with enormous mountains of used clothes in the Chilean desert, which aren't ever going to be used for anything, they're just going to sit there and rot. So actually it made me think that if I was going to donate clothes, do some sort of initiative, or if I was going to look for clothes that had recycled clothing in them, I would want to look for some sort of certification standard, something like the Global Recycling Standard, which actually says this is going to be recycled, and look, here it is in a demonstrable product. So finding somebody who backs it up as a third party rather than just taking people's words for it.
Yeah. Emma, similar question.
I don't think I can pinpoint kind of any one particular thing, but I'm very grateful for the time that I spent living in South America. I was living for 5 years in a very rural area in the high Andes, and I worked there connecting communities of indigenous women, textile artisans. And I think it was a long time after I came back that I really appreciated what that way of living brought to the way that I go about work, from having lived somewhere where there was nothing to want. Everything was made or it was grown. If it was made, it was generally made in a very slow artisanal process. And from the second that I set foot in Heathrow, I started to find myself wanting things. I want that smoothie. And it was something I'd existed without for the whole time that I was abroad. So I think that it just provided a very kind of stark counterpoint, I guess, to kind of life here, and something that I try to remember. It's very easy to get sucked into wanting things as a consumer. And equally, I had the opportunity to really appreciate a very slow way of life that was very much connected to landscape and to community and to the seasons, and I had time to witness that. And that's something that I'm lucky, I think, to have found now. I used to live in Bristol and now I live in Stroud on a small holding, and to some extent I feel like I have that there. And that's why I think it's so important to take people out of the studio, out of the city, and to give them the opportunity to reconnect through their craft and through their profession, but to a landscape, ideally one they can connect with.
And what are some of the habits or practices that you have on a daily or weekly basis to help you maintain that balance? Because I live in London, in Hackney, and I have to say it's a real struggle not to fall into the consumerist mindset when it's all around you.
I mean, Stroud has very little. I love the farmer's market, and I just want vegetables. I milk goats. I muck out goats. I live in a house that's got very little heating and probably won't do for the next 10 years till my husband finishes doing the work he needs to do. So, life can be very simple.
And Belle, come to you in terms of some of the question, I guess, around positive change, and it's a really nuanced panel, I think. Obviously there's a lot of negative things, but I think there's a lot of optimism as well. How do you strike that balance between being aware of how challenging everything is, how bad things are, but then finding optimism and managing to campaign onwards? Is that a struggle, or what's your advice for people who are in that climate anxiety space?
We were talking about this before. It's really interesting. So I was really thinking about my mindset. Yeah, I get, particularly after this summer, I found this summer really hard. It was like everything that we've been talking about for the last 5 years was coming to fruition because of the fires and the drought. On the other hand, I feel now that I lead a much richer life. My soul, I'm going to sound. I'm at peace in some ways because I know I'm working on what I should be working on. So there's a lot of peace in that. It is a constant balance. I am very rarely struck immobile by the bad news. In fact, bad news makes me work harder, and it makes me focus on what's really important. And so weirdly, I was thinking I laugh more easily these days because the little things in life don't bother me because they're not important. And the wonderful things in life, like being in nature or being with my daughter, mean so much more. So it's a really odd mindset. I can't describe it. Yeah, that's about as much as I can do. I live between grief and joy, and action, and just chatting to ordinary people and finding spaces. I don't know. What's the option? We can't stop trying. We were saying just now, for every 0.1% of temperature that we pull back from, because we're currently headed for about 3 to 4 degrees of warming, but every percentage of warming that we can pull back from will save thousands, if not millions, of lives. So what is the option? To not do anything? So, I've had my low moments, but I haven't stopped trying, and I've completely reconfigured my life. I'm not a fashion editor, I'm not working for anyone, I'm a freelancer, trying to do only the jobs that I think have conscience and ethics, and I work for the Climate Centre, trying to reach out to ordinary people with events that I think will activate and engage them, to talk about the climate from wherever they are, which can be frustrating because sometimes they don't know very much, but can be also brilliant.
And are there other historic examples that we can take inspiration of, of being faced with major social injustices that we have managed to solve? Are there examples that we can...
Yeah, the pandemic. We kind of, most people I know sort of found moments of joy in the pandemic. I think sometimes people talk about the Second World War, how we did manage to rally, and that actually maybe that's the kind of mindset we need to readopt for this situation, arguably the greatest challenge we've ever faced. So there is a lot of great stuff about human nature that I actually feel is being suppressed by systems of corporations and multinationals. You know, we are essentially a kindly race, you know, but we're being so disempowered and forced to focus on, I need to buy my next pair of jeans, or, you know, it's frustrating.
And same question, Emma and Sophie, other positive examples or things that can give us, or have given you as an individual inspiration?
I always like to look towards food systems. So when I was living in Bristol, it was a sustainable food city. I ended up going to a number of events all about sustainable food as part of the slow food movement. But I'd sit there and listen, why aren't we having these same conversations about fibre? And that was in 2014 or 2015. And I think it was just one step too far away. And then since then we've had kind of multiple crises stack up, kind of more acknowledgement of the fact we are in climate crisis. There was the Rana Plaza disaster, there was Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion, and I think, you know, there's finally this acknowledgement that we need to be considering the same questions and thinking about where our clothes come from. And I find it really inspiring, the strength now of kind of food sovereignty movements and organic food boxes, and the pandemic only served to increase, I think, the number of organic consumers within the UK who are looking to try and source things organically. So I see that as a real positive.
I think for me it's actually sort of looking forward in the next generation that are sort of coming up. I think we've all seen how passionate, particularly Gen Z, are about the environment and how they are actively working to try to create solutions. In large part that's because they're going to be far more affected than any of our older generations by the environmental change. But actually being able to see a whole generation that is really engaged, despite the fact that they're the ones being marketed at primarily by all of these massive corporations, and yet they're so passionate and they're so determined. So I take great hope from that.
Great. I think one of the other things that gives me a lot of optimism as well is, historically, it isn't actually the majority that change things. You know, the opinion polls on Martin Luther King never had about more than 35% approval. The vast majority of people disapproved of Martin Luther King. I think that's one example, and it's replicated in all social movements. So we actually don't need, sometimes you think, why don't my friends get this, or why doesn't my family get this, or why aren't they with me on it? We don't actually need them. We just need to get the right people and to get on with it. So I might just close the panel formally on that note. We are going to take questions, but thank you all very much. So we do have time for questions. So if there's any questions, let us know. Yeah, we have one right there, the white jacket. We have a roving mic coming towards it because we are recording this.
Hi, thank you so much for that panel talk. It's so interesting to hear from you all. And my question is really to do with, recently I was reading about the Higg Index, which votes on kind of preferred fibres, and there was a recent controversy that they were ranking vegan leather from petrochemicals as more sustainable as certain like natural fibres. And I think it really got me thinking that, you know, there's a lot of money in sustainability. People pay to kind of learn from the Higg Index or learn from kind of certification schemes. And I'm very much in agreement that degrowth is the answer, but what I'm interested in knowing is degrowth compatible with kind of capitalism, I guess, because even sustainability initiatives, they operate within the capitalist system. So are we getting to a stage where it's kind of either degrowth or certification schemes? Are the two compatible? And I know that's a real kind of systems question, but yeah, it's just something that really interests me.
That's a great question.
Well, as I said earlier, like if we're looking at organic cotton, for example, it's only making up 1% of all the cotton that's produced. So yes, I think it can be. of course, we're a certification body, we need to make money in order to fund the research and the work that we do. But if people are beginning to make better choices, because people still need to wear clothes, they always will, and they're putting their money in better options, then actually that can sort of answer both. Carry on.
So we produce 100 billion items of clothing a year, and even if every one of those was made out of good materials, it's going to be too much for the planet. So degrowth has to happen. Is degrowth compatible with a capitalist system? I don't want to get too political here, but there's a lot of talk saying capitalism has to. Oh right, okay. Capitalism can't. Any system that involves investment creating profit for a small minority of people is going to look really bad in the future. And I'm holding this, you can buy it downstairs, the Anti-Capitalist Book of Fashion. And it is incredible, it's a great book. So yeah, technically, no, we are looking at other systems. Now, when you say, okay, it has to be the end of capitalism, we're not then saying, okay, then the only option is communism. No, we have to be much more sophisticated and nuanced. There must be another way of valuing things, of paying for things. There has to be, because capitalism is, quite frankly, driving us off the edge of this cliff. It's promoting growth when we can't grow in this way anymore. So yeah, difficult question though. It's a really, and again, like degrowth, it gets people very nervy. We have to find another way.
I need to say, I mean, the fibre shed model is a political movement as much as a fashion one or an agriculture one, and it's very much advocating for a total paradigm shift. But that requires a transition, and in that transition, the more tools, standards, schemes that we have available to us to ensure that things are moving in the right direction, and so the better.
Right. Eco-socialism. Sorry, really bad cop.